By the summer of 1916, the British Army had convinced itself of something that was not true. They believed the wire would be cut. They believed the German trenches after 7 days of shelling would be empty. They believed the men walking across no man's land at a steady pace would meet a broken enemy. By 9 o'clock that morning, 19,240 British soldiers were dead. Another 35,000 lay wounded. It remains, to this day, the worst single morning in the history of the British Army. But the men who climbed those ladders at 7:30 did not know any of this. They believed what they had been told. They had written letters home the night before, sealed them, handed them to the chaplain. Some had shaved. Some had prayed. Some had simply waited. These men knew only what their officers had promised them. They walked forward. Most never came back. These are the names the casualty lists kept silent the morning of July 1st, 1916. The plan was meant to be the end of the war. General Sir Douglas Haig and General Sir Henry Rawlinson had spent the spring of 1916 drawing arrows across maps of the Picardy countryside. The French were bleeding white at Verdun, over 300,000 of them by midsummer, and London had promised Paris a relief offensive. The Somme Valley was chosen not because it was weak, it was chosen because it was where the British and French lines met. Rawlinson wanted a limited bite-and-hold attack. Haig wanted a breakthrough. The compromise satisfied neither. Well, the bombardment was meant to do the work. 1,738,000 shells were fired over 7 days. The largest artillery preparation in human history up to that point. The guns could be heard in Hampstead Heath, 200 miles away. Men in the trenches said the ground did not stop trembling. Officers told their men the wire would be gone, that the German dugouts would be tombs, that the infantry would simply walk across, occupy the enemy line, and brew tea by lunchtime. Some battalions were ordered to advance at a walking pace, in straight lines, 50 yards apart. Running, they were told, would tire the men before they reached the objective. What nobody in the planning rooms understood or chose to understand was that the German dugouts on this sector were 30 feet deep, concrete-lined, furnished. The garrison of the German Second Army did not die in the bombardment. They sat below the earth, in the dark, listening to the shells, waiting. You see, there was another problem. A great many of the British shells were shrapnel designed to cut wire and kill men in the open. Against deep dugouts and against thick belts of barbed wire, shrapnel did almost nothing, and of the high explosive shells that were fired, perhaps 1 in 3 failed to detonate. They are still being pulled from the fields of the Somme today, more than 100 years later. A junior officer of the Royal Engineers wrote in his diary on the evening of June 30th. He noted that the wire in front of his sector looked, to his eye, entirely uncut. He wrote, "I am told not to mention this to the men." He would be killed the following morning. He was 23. At 10 minutes past 7 on the morning of July 1st, the British detonated the largest mine yet used in the war. 40,000 pounds of ammonal buried under the German redoubt at Hawthorne Ridge. The earth lifted in a single dark column, 400 feet high, and hung there in the morning air. The officer who filmed it, Geoffrey Mallins, stood with his camera shaking. The footage survives. You can watch it today. But the mine went off 20 minutes before the infantry advanced. 20 minutes. That was the warning. The Germans climbed out of their dugouts, set up their machine guns on the parapets, and waited. The whistles blew at 7:30. Along 18 miles of front, between the villages of Gommecourt and Maricourt, around 100,000 British and Empire infantry climbed their ladders, walked through the gaps cut in their own wire, and began to move across no man's land. In some sectors that ground was 200 yards wide, in others closer to 700. They carried 66 pounds of equipment, rifle bayonet, 220 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, 2 sandbags, a steel helmet, a gas mask, a water bottle, 2 days' rations, a pick or a shovel, wire cutters, a field dressing. Some carried homing pigeons in wicker baskets. Some carried football. The 8th East Surreys kicked one across no man's land that morning. 3 of the 4 officers who kicked it were dead before they reached the German wire. The machine guns opened up within seconds. The German Maxim, the MG 0-8, fired 450 rounds a minute. There were, by careful German count, around 100 machine guns facing the British advance that morning. The arithmetic was not complicated. A man walking at 3 miles an hour across 400 yards of open ground would be in the killing zone for approximately 8 minutes. Most men did not have 8 minutes. The official histories speak of withering fire and heavy casualties. The men who survived used different words. One private of the 10th West Yorkshires, interviewed 40 years later, said only that he remembered the noise, and then the silence, and then the moaning. He would not say more. The interviewer did not press him. A sergeant of the 1st Newfoundland wrote a note to his mother that morning before going over. He wrote, "If this reaches you, I have done my best." He was killed within 40 minutes of leaving his trench. He was 26. Of the 800 Newfoundlanders who advanced at Beaumont Hamel that day, 68 answered roll call the next morning. Read that twice. There was an idea in the autumn of 1914 that men would fight better if they fought beside their friends. Lord Derby proposed it. The War Office endorsed it. Towns across the north of England were invited to raise their own battalions, clerks from the same office, miners from the same pit, boys from the same school. They would train together. They would sail together. They would, if it came to it, die together. They called them the PALS battalions. By the morning of July 1st, 1916, the PALs had been waiting in the line for 18 months. Most had never seen combat. The Somme was to be their first action. The Accrington PALs, officially the 11th East Lancashires, went over the top at 7:20 in the morning, opposite the village of Serres. They were 720 men strong. Within 20 minutes, 584 of them were dead, wounded, or missing. Accrington itself had a population of around 45,000. The telegrams began arriving on the 3rd of July. By the 7th, the town clerk had stopped reading them aloud at the post office. The Leeds PALs, the 15th West Yorkshires, advanced at the same hour, on the same sector. They lost 24 officers and 504 men in 3 minutes. The Sheffield City Battalion lost 512. The Bradford PALs, in 2 battalions, lost 1,770 between them before noon. You see, this is what no one had thought about. When a battalion is raised from a single street, a single mill, a single chapel, when it is killed, it is not the army that mourns. It is one town, one pew, one factory floor. In Accrington, on the evening of July 3rd, a crowd gathered outside the post office and would not leave. They stood in the rain. No one in the town had been told officially. They simply knew. A corporal of the Sheffield City Battalion, who survived because a shell knocked him unconscious in the second wave, wrote home a week later. His letter was brief. He wrote, "I am the only one left of our table." He had trained with 11 friends from the same accounting firm. He was the only one to come home. He never spoke of the war again. His daughter, decades later, found the letter folded inside a tin in the attic. The official communiqué from General Headquarters that evening called the day very satisfactory. Let his name stand and the names of the others against that sentence. If you have made it this far, you understand. This is not a war story. This is a list of names that history nearly buried. Stay with me. Wire. For 7 days, the British guns had been told to cut it. The infantry, climbing the ladders that morning, had been told it was gone. In sector after sector along the 18-mile front, it was not gone. A subaltern of the 10th Lincolns, the Grimsby Chums, reached the German wire at around 20 minutes to 8. He found it standing in places 10 feet deep, the strands as thick as a man's thumb, twisted into knots the shells had not touched. He turned to signal his men back. He was shot through the throat before he could lower his arm. The wire on the Somme was not ordinary wire. The Germans had been improving their defences for 20 months. The belts were laid in zigzag patterns, anchored on iron pickets driven deep into the chalk. Behind the first belt, a second. Behind the second, in many places, a third. A man trying to crawl through was easy work for a rifleman at 50 yards. The shrapnel shells, which had been fired in their hundreds of thousands, were supposed to cut this wire by exploding above it and showering it with steel balls. In practice, the steel balls bent the wire. They did not sever it. Officers walking the line on the night of June 30th had reported this. Their reports were filed, and in many cases, ignored. A captain of the public schools battalion wrote in his last letter, sent home on the evening of June 30th, that the wire opposite his sector was, in his words, untouched. He wrote, "I do not think we shall come back from this one." He was killed at approximately 7:45 the following morning. He was 29. His body was never recovered. His name is one of the 72,000 carved on the Teepville Memorial Men of the Somme who have no known grave. You see, this is the thing the histories rarely dwell on. The men who died that morning did not die in confusion. Many of them knew. They knew the wire was uncut. They knew the bombardment had failed. They wrote home and said so. And then, when the whistles blew, they climbed the ladders anyway, because they had been told to, because the man beside them was climbing, because that was what one did. Read that again. On the evening of June 30th, 1916, along 18 miles of trench, men sat down to write. The army had issued field service postcards, printed forms with options to be crossed out. I am quite well. I have been admitted into hospital. I have received your letter. Most men did not use them that night. The field postcard was for ordinary days. This was not an ordinary day. They wrote on whatever paper they had. Tin lids, ration packet wrappers, the backs of letters already received. A great many wrote by candlelight, in dugouts that smelled of damp wool and chloride of lime. Some wrote standing up, leaning against the trench wall. The chaplains collected the letters. The chaplains knew what they were collecting. By unwritten agreement, the letters marked with a small cross in the corner were the ones to be sent only if the writer did not return. Tens of thousands were marked that night. Well, the letters that survive, the ones held now in the Imperial War Museum, in regimental archives, in shoeboxes, in suburban attics, share a strange quietness. There is very little fear in them. There is a great deal of love. There are instructions about the dog, about the allotment, about a younger brother who must not, under any circumstances, be allowed to enlist. A private of the 1st Tyneside Irish wrote to his wife in Newcastle. He told her where he had hidden his savings book. He wrote, "If this is the last, kiss the children for me." He was killed at approximately 7:35 the following morning, within sight of his own trench. He was 31. His wife received the letter on July 6th. She received the telegram on July 7th. A lance corporal of the 12th York and Lancasters, the Sheffield City Battalion, wrote to his mother on the same evening. He apologized for not writing more often. He thanked her for the socks. He wrote, "Do not grieve too long for me, mother." He was 18 years old. What would you have written home if you had only one letter left? Ah, there is one more. A letter discovered in 1968, in the lining of a tunic returned to a family in Manchester half a century after the man's death. It was unsigned. It was addressed to no one. It read, in part, "I am not afraid. I am only sorry." 9 words. No name. The tunic had belonged to a sergeant of the Manchester Pals. He was 24. He was buried where he fell, in a shallow grave that was lost to subsequent shelling. He has no known grave. His name is on the Thiepval Memorial, somewhere among the 72,000. Sun set on the 1st of July at 9:09 in the evening. By then, the attack was, in every meaningful sense, over. Some isolated parties of British infantry still held fragments of the German front line at Montauban and Mametz on the southern sector, where, it should be said, the bombardment had largely succeeded and the wire had been cut. North of the Albert Bapaume Road, the entire offensive had failed before 9 in the morning. The men who could crawl back, crawled back. Those who could not, lay where they had fallen. No man's land, on the evening of July 1st, held something close to 57,470 British and Empire casualties. The exact figure was not known that night. It would take 3 days to compile. It would take 3 months for the lists, in small black-bordered print, to finish appearing in the local newspapers of every county in the United Kingdom. 19,240 dead, 35,493 wounded, 2,152 missing, 585 taken prisoner. Read those numbers slowly. Each one is a man. The wounded lay in no man's land for, in some cases, 3 days and 3 nights. The Germans, by most accounts, did not fire on stretcher parties that came out under white flags during the first evening. By the second day, with the British offensive resuming further south, they had stopped granting that mercy. Men died of thirst within yards of their own wire. Men crawled into shell holes and were never found. Men lay calling out names their own, their mothers', the names of friends already dead until they fell silent. The first 9 entries were the ones the official histories chose to remember. The last one is the one they wanted erased. The roll calls began at dusk and continued into the early hours of July 2nd. A subaltern of the Accrington Pals read the names of his platoon by the light of a hurricane lamp. 42 names. He received 11 answers. He read the list a second time, in case anyone had been confused. He received the same 11 answers. In the village of Albert, behind the British lines, the dressing stations had been overwhelmed by 10 in the morning. By midnight, surgeons were operating in the open, in the rain, by the light of acetylene lamps. Many of the wounded did not survive the journey from no man's land to the surgeon's table. Many more did not survive the table. In London, the first casualty lists were not released until July 3rd. The early editions of the newspapers on July 2nd carried the official communiqué from General Headquarters. It read that the day had been, all things considered, satisfactory, that British forces had carried the enemy's front trenches on a wide front, that casualties had not been heavy. That sentence appeared in print on the morning when, across the north of England, 57,000 telegrams were being prepared. Let that stand without comment. The Battle of the Somme did not end on July 1st. It continued for 141 days. It would, by its conclusion in mid-November, cost the British Empire around 420,000 casualties. The French, 200,000. The Germans, by their own count, around 465,000. The front line, after all of it, had moved forward by approximately 6 miles. But the first day belongs to itself. The first day stands apart. In the years that followed, the towns of the north of England would build their memorials. Accrington, Barnsley, Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford, Hull, Grimsby. The stonemasons could not always keep up with the lists of names. In some towns, the names were carved on more than one wall, because one wall was not enough. Well, the men who came home did not, for the most part, speak. There is a pattern in the oral histories collected in the 1960s and 70s. The interviewer asks about July 1st. The veteran answers in 2 or 3 sentences. Then the veteran stops. Then there is a long silence. Then the veteran says, almost always, the same thing, that one had to have been there, that words would not serve. A private of the 10th Lincolns, interviewed in 1973 at the age of 79, was asked what he remembered most. He thought for a long time. He said, the boots, the empty boots in the trench. After. That was all he would say. You see, the Thiepval Memorial, on the ridge above the old battlefield, was unveiled in 1932. It carries the names of 72,337 men of the Somme who have no known grave. Most of them died between July and November of 1916. A great many died on the first day. The names are arranged by regiment. The carving is small, to fit them all. A visitor standing at the base of the memorial cannot read the names at the top without binoculars. This was not an oversight. It was the only way. If you stand on the ridge at Thiepval today, the fields below are green, the trenches are gone, the wire is gone, the dressing stations are gone. The villages have been rebuilt, brick by brick, on their original foundations. Children walk to school past the cemeteries. There are a great many cemeteries. What remains more than a century on is the arithmetic. 19,240 men, one morning, one country. One generation, very nearly, of a particular kind, the volunteers of 1914, the clerks and the miners and the schoolmasters and the boys from the PALS battalions, the men who had answered the poster on the wall and signed the form and waited 18 months in the line for an order to walk forward at a steady pace.